Enoch Powell's an interesting example. Like Nietzsche, who was given a sort of university professorship when he was 24, Powell was given a professorship at the University of Sydney in Australia when he was 24 years of age. Powell could speak 10 European languages.
Who you're talking about, Enoch Powell? You're talking about Powell, right? Did you know him personally? Did you ever meet him?
I met him towards the end of his life. Like a lot of allegedly dictatorial men, he was extraordinarily short. He used to stand on a box to address meetings that was concealed behind the podium. You know, he came from quite a long line of sort of Napoleon-esque men in various ways. The irony is that Powell was, in many respects, an extremely right-wing liberal. He was at the outermost cusp of the old Tory party. He was very much an economic liberal, very anti-statist, very anti-socialist. Some of his values were not far right at all, but would be, say, close to, economically, people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek and the Austrian school. Don't forget the great reaction in Britain is against the post-war planned welfare state, deficit financing and Keynesianism. So many fiscal conservatives looked to be in that sort of area and wouldn't be regarded as radical right at all. On certain other areas, Powell was out of grain with what might be called a compassionate society. He was Minister of Health in the 1950s, and you may remember there was a scandal about birth defects with a drug called thalidomide, and he had to deal with that. And he was, although he turned to Christianity in his middle life, a high church, high Anglican, Anglo-Catholic type of Christianity, a bit like T.S. Eliot, the poet. Early in his life, and Powell was also a poet actually, he'd been very strongly influenced by Nietzsche, and that certain intellectual implacability influenced Powell throughout his life. Powell's most famous with the masses for speaking out against mass third world immigration into Britain in the late 1960s, which catapulted him from obscure Tory ministerial ambition to be somebody that skinheads and football fans and the overwhelming mass of the population heard of. And he then became one of the most significant men in the country because he dared to speak about issues which virtually no one else in the establishment would. Powell was an outsider in many ways, despite his intellectual accomplishments. He was seen as an outsider. He didn't obtain the leadership of the Conservative Party in and around 1970. He later advocated that people should vote Labour in order to get a referendum or membership of the European Union, the sort of putative federation that exists in this part of the world, that right-wing, nativist and nationalistic people across Europe tend to oppose. Not all, but most of them do. He was an Ulster Unionist, of course, which got him involved in radical Protestant-type politics in relation to the sort of war that people will have heard of in Northern Ireland. But Powell was one of these figures that Britain has grown up in the last 100 years. Joseph Chamberlain at the beginning of the 20th century, Sir Oswald Mosley in the middle of the 20th century, and Enoch Powell at the end of the 20th century, who posited an alternative political trajectory for Britain. They were very radical men. They didn't really have an allegiance to party, hence there's a nationalistic strand to all of them. Powell was a member of the Tory party, a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, advocated voting Labour at times tactically. Mosley was a member of both the Tory and the Labour parties before he founded a new party that then became the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. Joseph Chamberlain began in the Liberal Party, then formed his own Liberal Unionist Party, then moved over to the Tories. The Liberal Unionists were probably proto-fascistic in the late years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, in all honesty.
Jonathan, how did it affect your trajectory, if I can put it that way? Because you had at some point a couple of years ago quite a prominent role as a cultural advisor for Nick Griffin. I don't want to get into those squabbles and what happened, but could you just give us a rough idea to what extent Enoch Powell and then Tyndall, how did it affect your political, in this particular case, your political trajectory, not intellectual so much?
Yes, I mean, politically, in some ways the two are combined, because the one thing I always thought about conservatism, even very right-wing conservatism, is Powell to one side. There's a great cultural aridness there. There's a strong anti-intellectuality and philistinism in conservatism per se, particularly its British example. Philosophers taught in France from the age of 6, but the British culture, particularly English culture, is strongly pragmatic, strongly sort of non-heuristic, is anti-conceptual, practical and pragmatic and utilitarian. Margaret Thatcher was a scientist. And it showed in the politics, and particularly the cultural politics of her government, when you bear in mind that she had as much power as Reagan had in the United States, particularly in the first term, and yet virtually nothing was done with this cultural power. There was a few items, a minor issue about homosexuality, the so-called Clause 28, and tacit support for white South Africa. But apart from these things, you know, all other institutions, in particular the BBC, were left in the hands of her most sort of ferocious opponents.